Welcome back to Earthly Delights, my fellow growers, garden dreamers, and tomato lovers. If you are the kind of person who checks on your plants before breakfast, saves eggshells and kitchen scraps, just in case they might help the garden, worries over yellow leaves, and celebrates every new flower like a small miracle, then you are in exactly the right place today. Have you ever given a plant your full attention, good soil, careful watering, daily hope, only to watch it sit there, stalled, pale, and disappointing? I've seen it happen to beginners, to seasoned gardeners, to people growing in raised beds, backyard rows, and even small home gardens where every plant matters. And when it comes to tomatoes, the problem usually starts long before the plant begins to struggle above ground. So today we are not just talking about growing tomatoes. We are talking about what to put in the planting hole before that tomato ever touches the soil. Because once the roots go down into a poor foundation, you are already playing catch up. That is why so many plants look promising early in the season, then lose strength when it matters most. In this episode, I'm going to walk you through the hidden foundation that can change everything. Simple ingredients, practical choices, and the real reasons some tomato plants take off while others never quite recover. We are going to dig into timing, soil warmth, root energy, and the small decisions that lead to a bigger harvest later on. So if you love practical garden wisdom, real growing experience, and simple methods that actually make a difference, subscribe to Earthly Delights, and let's get our hands in the soil. Section 1, Magnesium, the invisible foundation, timing and temperature. Let me ask you something. Have you ever tried to push a big change in life before the timing was right? Most of the time, it does not create momentum. It creates stress. We tense up, we stall, and instead of moving forward, we hold ourselves back. Tomato plants respond in much the same way. The first and most damaging mistake many gardeners make happens before the plant ever goes into the ground. It comes down to timing, and more specifically, the temperature of the soil. Tomatoes are warm season plants by nature. Their origins trace back to tropical regions of the Americas. And because of that, they are simply not built to thrive in cold ground. If your soil is still below 60 degrees Fahrenheit or 15.5 degrees Celsius, then whatever you add to that planting hole is not going to deliver the result you hope for. The issue is not that the nutrients are missing. The issue is that the roots are too sluggish to absorb them. Cold soil slows the metabolic activity of the plant so much that even a well-prepared planting hole can go to waste. It is like setting a full meal in front of someone who is fast asleep. The food is there, but they are in no condition to take it in. When a tomato goes into cold soil, it often enters a stalled state right away. Growth slows, roots hesitate, and the plant struggles to take up key nutrients, especially phosphorus. That is why you may sometimes notice a purplish cast under the leaves. The nutrient may be present in the soil, but the plant cannot access it efficiently because the conditions are working against it. So here is a simple habit I want you to remember. Push 2 fingers about 2 inches into the soil and hold them there for 5 seconds. If the ground feels uncomfortably cold, do not plant yet. Wait a few more days, even a full week if needed. I know that is hard when spring excitement kicks in and you are eager to get growing, but planting too early in cold soil can wipe out the advantage you thought you were gaining. In the garden, patience is not hesitation, it is strategy. Healthy growth begins when the environment is ready to support it. And once that foundation is finally warm, then we can move to the next step, because a tomato planted into properly warm soil immediately begins searching for the one thing it needs most. Section 2, the engine of growth, phosphorus and bone meal. The moment a tomato plant settles into warm ground, its first priority is not top growth. It is not flowers. It is not fruit. It is roots. Before that plant can become tall, lush, and productive, it has to build the underground system that will support everything above the surface. And to do that well, it needs phosphorus. Those first 2 weeks after transplanting are critical. This is the window when the plant is trying to establish itself, divide cells rapidly in the root zone, and anchor into its new home. If root development is weak during this stage, the whole season can feel the effects. A plant without a strong root system has no real engine. It cannot pull in water efficiently, It cannot access nutrients consistently, and it cannot sustain the kind of vigorous growth gardeners hope to see. That is why one of the best ingredients to place in the planting hole is bone meal. Bone meal is a dependable source of phosphorus, and it also brings calcium into the mix. But the real key is how you use it. You do not just scatter it vaguely around the plant and hope for the best. You place about 2 tablespoons at the very bottom of the hole, right where the roots are going to head first. This matters because you want those young roots to discover that nutrient reserve as early as possible. You are not feeding leaves at this stage. You are fueling the underground work that makes everything else possible later on. Bone meal also has the advantage of being slow release and organic, which means it stays in place far better than quick synthetic products that can wash away with spring rain before the plant has a chance to benefit. And this is where experienced gardeners learn to think differently. So much attention goes to what shows above the soil line: the size of the plant, the color of the leaves, the first flowers, the promise of fruit. But the truth is, the visible success always depends on the invisible foundation. If the roots are underfed, the whole plant becomes vulnerable. Feed the roots well, and you give the tomato a real chance to explode with healthy growth in the days ahead. Section 3. The unsung hero of green: magnesium and Epsom salt. Now, once those roots begin searching and that foundation is in place, there is another piece of the puzzle that many gardeners overlook until the leaves start sending out distress signals. Have you ever looked at a tomato plant and thought, everything seems fine, so why does it still look tired? Why is the leaf fading between the veins while the veins themselves stay green? That pattern catches people off guard every year, and a lot of them jump straight to overwatering, disease, or some mystery problem in the soil. But in many cases, what the plant is really asking for is magnesium. This is where Epsom salt comes in. Epsom salt is magnesium sulfate, and magnesium plays a central role inside the chlorophyll molecule itself. In other words, it helps power the process that allows the plant to turn sunlight into usable energy. Without enough magnesium, your tomato may still be standing, but it will not be working at full strength. The green cells lose efficiency, photosynthesis slows down, and the plant starts to look drained long before it ever reaches its full potential. The key here is precision. Add 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt into the planting hole, along with the bone meal, and that is enough. And I want to be very clear about this because this is one of those areas where good intentions can do real damage. Too much Epsom salt is not extra help. It creates imbalance. Magnesium and calcium compete in the root zone, and when magnesium becomes excessive, it can interfere with calcium uptake. That is when a gardener who thought they were helping may actually be setting the stage for serious problems later. So remember this as we build the perfect tomato hole. Balance matters just as much as nutrition. In gardening, as in life, more is not always better. The right amount at the right time can strengthen a plant beautifully. Too much, even of something useful, can clog the system and work against the growth you were hoping to create. And that brings us naturally to the next piece. Because once calcium uptake is disrupted, the consequences often show up in one of the most heartbreaking ways a tomato grower can experience. Section 4. The shield against decay: calcium, eggshells, and tums. If you have grown tomatoes for any length of time, you have probably seen it. The fruit starts out beautiful, full of promise, nearly ripe, and then you turn it over and there it is, that dark, sunken patch on the bottom. Blossom end, rot. Few things disappoint a gardener faster, especially after weeks of careful watering, feeding, and waiting. Most people assume it is a disease, or they blame inconsistent watering alone. But at its core, this is usually a calcium issue. And the frustrating part is that by the time you see that damage on the fruit, the real problem started much earlier, often when the plant was still young and trying to settle into the soil. In other words, the failure did not begin at harvest time. It began back at planting. Now let's talk honestly about one of the most common pieces of gardening advice out there: eggshells. Yes, eggshells contain calcium. That part is true. But whole eggshells, or even roughly crushed ones, break down very slowly in the soil, often far too slowly to help a tomato plant during the current season. By the time that calcium becomes available, your plant may already be long past the point where it needed it most. If you want eggshell calcium to become useful sooner, you have to process it properly. Bake the shells until they turn brittle, then grind them down into a very fine powder. That fine texture increases surface area and allows soil microbes to work on it much faster. But if you want a simpler and faster source of calcium right at planting time, there is another option sitting in the medicine aisle. Crush 2 plain Tums tablets and drop the powder into the hole. Tums are made mostly of calcium carbonate, and when placed directly in the root zone, they can begin breaking down far sooner than coarse eggshells ever will. That means the plant has access to calcium much earlier, when it matters most, instead of struggling along and showing symptoms weeks later when the damage is already visible. A good garden teaches this lesson again and again. A resource is only useful when it becomes available at the right time and in the right form. That is true for calcium, and it is true for growth itself. What sits hard and unchanged cannot nourish much of anything, but once it is broken down and made accessible, it can become exactly the support a struggling plant needs. And from here, we move into one of the oldest and strangest planting traditions of all. One that sounds unusual at first, but has deep roots in real growing wisdom. Section 5, the native wisdom, the fish head miracle. And now we come to the boldest ingredient on this list, the one that makes some people laugh, some people hesitate, and experienced growers lean in a little closer. The fish head. I know how it sounds. Strange, old-fashioned, maybe even a little extreme. But this is not some trendy garden shortcut that appeared out of nowhere. This practice reaches back through generations of traditional growing knowledge. For a very long time, gardeners in different parts of the world understood that buried fish could feed crops in a powerful and lasting way. As it breaks down in the soil, it releases nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, and a wide range of trace minerals slowly, right where the roots can benefit. Just as important, it helps wake up microbial life in the soil, and that living soil is part of what makes the whole system work. But there is a very real catch here, and it matters. If you bury a fish head too close to the surface, you are not preparing a feast for your tomato plant. You are putting out an invitation for raccoons, skunks, neighborhood cats, and anything else with a strong nose and a willingness to dig. They will tear up your planting area in no time trying to get to it. So if you want to use this old method well, you have to respect the depth. Dig much deeper than a normal transplant hole, often 2 to 3 feet if your soil allows it. Place the fish head at the bottom, cover it with a solid layer of soil, and only then set your tomato above it. That separation gives the material time to break down below, while the plant settles in safely above. A healthy garden reminds us that one cycle always feeds the next. What looks like waste in one season can become stored strength for the season that follows. Handled wisely, even decay becomes nourishment. And speaking of unlikely helpers, the next ingredient may surprise you just as much, because it comes not from the garden shed or the compost pile, but from the medicine cabinet. Section 6, the medicine cabinet secret, aspirin and immunity. What if I told you there is a simple way to help a tomato plant strengthen its defenses before disease ever gets the upper hand? Tomatoes are productive plants, but they are also vulnerable ones. Blights, fungal pressure, and wet weather can turn a beautiful patch into a frustrating mess faster than many gardeners expect. That is why aspirin has earned attention in gardening circles. The active ingredient in regular aspirin is acetylsalicylic acid, and when it dissolves in water, it leads to salicylic acid, a compound closely tied to the natural signaling systems plants use when responding to stress. In simple terms, it helps activate the plant's internal defense pathways. When you dissolve 1 or 2 uncoated 325 milligram aspirin tablets in a gallon of water and use it as a root drench or place a tablet into the planting hole, you may help trigger what is known as systemic acquired resistance, or SAR. Think of it as priming the plant's defenses early. The tomato senses a warning, responds as if pressure is coming, and begins turning on protective systems before a major threat arrives. That early response can support stronger disease resistance, better leaf hydration, and even more efficient photosynthesis as the plant gets established. Now, this is not magic, and it does not replace good spacing, healthy soil, or sound watering habits. But used carefully, it can be one more helpful layer in a well-built foundation. And that is really the lesson here. A little challenge, introduced at the right time and in the right amount, can make a living thing more resilient. In the garden, gentle pressure can wake up strength. And once you understand that, you are ready for the next part. Because even the best planting hole can be undone by a few costly mistakes right after the tomato goes in. Section 7. The most expensive mistakes: watering and nitrogen traps. Now we come to the part where so many gardeners undo all the good work they have just done. The hole is prepared, the ingredients are in place, the plant is ready to go in, and then one wrong move changes the whole outcome. The first mistake is adding a strong synthetic fertilizer that is heavy in nitrogen right into the planting hole. I understand why people do it. The label looks convincing, the marketing is aimed straight at tomato growers, and it promises fast results. But early in the season, too much nitrogen pushes the plant to make leaves and stems, not deep roots and not fruit. You may end up with a big, lush, dark green plant that looks impressive from a distance, but when summer rolls on, it gives you very little in return because it never received the right signal at the right time. The second mistake is just as important, and it has everything to do with how you prepare the hole before those ingredients go in. Water first, always. Soak the empty hole well, let that moisture settle and drain, and only then add the bone meal, the Epsom salt, and the calcium source. Dry soil combined with concentrated amendments can create hot spots around the root zone. Instead of feeding tender young roots, you risk burning them before the plant even has a chance to establish itself. And then there is the mistake that comes after planting, during those first 14 days when the plant is adjusting to its new home. A newly transplanted tomato often looks a little stressed, especially in the afternoon warmth. Many gardeners see that drooping and immediately assume the plant is desperate for more water. But that is not always what is happening. Often the plant is simply going through transplant shock, trying to regulate moisture loss while its roots begin exploring the surrounding soil. If you keep pouring on water every time the plant looks tired, you create a different problem. Saturated soil pushes oxygen out of the root zone, and roots need oxygen just as surely as they need water. When the soil stays too wet, the roots cannot breathe, they cannot function properly, and they cannot take up the nutrients you so carefully placed below. So give the plant one deep watering, then step back and let those roots go looking for what you buried for them. That is one of the hardest lessons in gardening. Real care is not smothering. Real care is building a strong foundation, then allowing enough space for healthy struggle, root expansion, and natural strength to develop. And once you understand that, the whole method comes together beautifully. Conclusion: the 14-day explosion. So let's bring the whole recipe together. Wait until the soil is above 60 degrees. Water the hole first and let it drain. Add 2 tablespoons of bone meal to feed root development, 1 tablespoon of Epsom salt to support chlorophyll and energy, and 2 crushed tums to provide a fast source of calcium. Plant your tomato deeply, removing the lower leaves so the buried stem can send out even more roots. And if you want to take it a step further, bury a fish head deep below and follow with an aspirin drench to help support the plant's natural defenses. In the first few days, your plant may look a little droopy. Do not panic. Around days 6 through 10, you will often notice the stem looking firmer, the posture improving, and the plant beginning to face the sun with more confidence. And by the time you reach day 14, that is when the real shift begins to show. Fresh top growth appears, the color deepens, and the plant starts to look like it has truly found its footing. Down below, the roots have reached the nutrient reserve you prepared for them. That is why this matters so much. We come to the garden hoping to grow food, but if we pay attention, the garden teaches us far more than that. It teaches us that timing matters, that balance matters, and that what happens below the surface often determines everything that follows above it. Thank you for spending this time with me here on Earthly Delights. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to the channel, share it with a fellow gardener, and tell me in the comments, what is the most unusual thing you have ever buried in the garden that actually helps something grow? Until next time, keep your hands dirty and your heart open.